Why are you afraid? I was so worried about dropping the iPad, I thought this would not be the way to start this. It's like, all of a sudden it just goes, thump. Rick goes, and then I'm like, well, let's pray. All right, so, hey, good morning. If we've not met before, my name's Dieni. I'm part of the advisory council here at Kingship. And it's a new year. It's time for a new sermon series, which I'm super excited to introduce. The topic we'll be going over, which Rick kind of spoiled for me for the next 2.5 months, is questions Jesus asked. I'm pretty sure this is not what we were looking for, right? What we really wanted was Jesus to just give us all the answers, right? I mean, I know I did. But as we look at Jesus' 3-year ministry, we see that he often responded to questions with a question back to the person asking. And we can even see him doing this as a kid, which of course we'll get to later in the series, but he often asked more questions than he answered. And why is that? So some of the people who asked him questions, they didn't have the most innocent of intentions, right? They were trying to trap him. Jesus responding with a question was not meant to mock, but rather to dispel their false narrative of reality. By asking a question, he's establishing a baseline of the truth to work from. Now, others that asked questions were like his disciples, and they were asking with genuine curiosity. Yet, Jesus still asked them a question back. Why? See, he wants us to become a believer who follows with assurance and confidence, to become someone who has fully thought out the cost of following him and accepts it wholeheartedly. To quote Jesus in Luke 14, to first sit down and count the cost before building our tower, the tower of our faith. See, Jesus' questions were never designed to confuse, but rather to teach a spiritual truth, to promote a new understanding of something. So my wife, Sarah, she homeschools our children, if you know her, and many times our kids will ask questions. I love these opportunities because it's a chance for me to show how smart I am, and I usually jump right in, and 2 + 2 is 4, right? This is a little bit too quick and apparently not what I'm supposed to do as a dad, and earns me a frown or a glare from her because she views this as an opportunity to ask the kids what they think the answer is. And this often leads to a much more in-depth discussion. I use 2 + 2 is 4. Please don't think my kids they're way beyond that level now, okay? Just want to be straight up. She uses this opportunity to engage them in a much more in-depth discussion and follow-up questions that not only help our children get to the right answer, but also to understand the topic at a much deeper level than they would have by just giving them the answer. And this is another aspect of why Jesus asked questions. See, Jesus is trying to provoke the listener to think and come to a deeper understanding of a spiritual truth, to not only own the answer, but also to own their faith. So each week, we'll tackle a new question that Jesus asked and go over how this impacted the listener at the time it was asked. We'll also examine just what does this mean for us today and how does it impact our lives. So the question we're tackling today, this is one of his more famous ones. Why are you afraid? On the surface, it seems like a bit of a silly question, right? I mean, why wouldn't you be afraid? There are so many things to be afraid of in life. How many of you guys have seen Progressive latest ad series, What Really Happened Replay? I love these things. These are so good.
Nice work. Never heard you scream like that before.
What?
Dad, it's not a big deal. I'm scared of spiders, too.
I know it's not a big deal. Because I didn't scream.
Oh, I see. You didn't scream.
No. So, that's why it's not a big deal.
Should we play it back?
Do it.
This What Really Happened replay is brought to you by Progressive. One thing no one would challenge, protecting your home and auto with Progressive.
Okay, so
that.
obviously this video is about a dad who is afraid of spiders, but won't admit to it. It's pretty funny, right? We can all laugh. Everyone laughs, right? Because it's very relatable, right? Like we all either are that guy or we know that guy who is absolutely afraid of spiders but would never admit to it, right? That's me. I mostly hate spiders. Something about them just kind of freaks me out. And I know I'm not alone because one night, Sarah and I were watching a movie on the couch with the lights off. And before we get too deep into these stories, I just want you guys to understand that I did vet all these stories with the people they're about, right? I think it's important to point out that I'm not dropping any bombs here that I'm going to get called out for later. So we're sitting on the couch watching a movie with the lights off, and all of a sudden she's kind of, starts yelling at me, "Get your feet up on the couch," right? Apparently, I'm pretty slow on the uptake, so I don't respond. I don't know what she's yelling about. She's over in her world. I'm watching the movie. But that prompted a much louder and more urgent plea to get my feet up right now. So I'm still unsure of the problem, so I'm now looking around at the floor to see what's really going on. And we're watching an action movie, and it's a dimly lit room. And so what the action movie is doing is basically strobing this 1/4-inch size spider that is moving across my floor at the speed of a Formula One car straight at my feet. At that point, I didn't need any more prompting. I pretty much kneed myself in the chin, getting my feet up off the floor. And of course, now the movie's over. We're not watching any more of it because we need to know where that thing went, right? So, you guys, a lot of you have kids, right? You've seen them at some point, like leaning over the edge of their bed, like holding on to it, trying to look under the bed. Yeah, 2 full-grown adults doing this in the front room on a couch that's only this wide. Don't fall on the floor, right? We don't know where this thing is yet. So, after we basically convinced ourselves that it's not coming back out to eat us if we put a foot on the floor, I quickly jumped off the couch, ran over to the light switch, and turned the lights on. Whew. Isn't it amazing how much less scary something or a situation can be once you've shined a light on it, right? Well, I mean, needless to say, that wasn't the end of it. We still needed to find this thing because nobody was going to feel safe watching the rest of the movie or going to bed until we discovered where this spider was and put it out of our misery. So, we did finally discover, we had to move some furniture, but we finally found it, vacuumed it up, and life returned to normal. Crisis averted. Whew. Now, spiders, for the most part, while extremely creepy to most people, are not really life-threatening. I mean, for the most part. There's a couple out there, but I digress. There are so many unknowns in life, bigger situations that come along, whether psychological or physical in nature. Psychological fears that live within our own heads apart from what many times is reality. Things like fear of rejection, fear of failure. There's any number of phobias out there. In researching this, I discovered erythrophobia. This is the fear of blushing. I didn't even know that was a possibility. Or hypochondria, the fear of becoming ill. There are also physical things that we fear, things beyond our control. Natural disasters such as tornadoes, earthquakes, fires. We can live in fear of physical violence. Fear, whether physical or mental, can be crippling. It can prevent us from taking chances that could lead to a better life for us. All right, another personal story. For the longest time, I worked at a 76 station. I began the job when I was about 21 years old and left it after about 2 years. I stayed through good and bad bosses. I was robbed on 3 separate occasions, 2 at knife point, once at gunpoint. And the one at gunpoint was particularly scary because Sarah got to listen to the whole thing on the phone because I had been talking to her when the guy pulled the gun and asked for everything in the register. In spite of all that, I stayed because I was more afraid of the unknown, of what I would do instead of that job that I was very familiar, very comfortable with. I stayed because of fear of rejection, putting myself out there and being told that I wasn't good enough for another job. It finally took a good friend to get me to try something else. And once I stepped out of that fear, I landed a much better job that paid almost $3 an hour more and had better benefits and working hours. See, fear can stop us from achieving our dreams. However, in spite of all the things that fear can prevent, it does have its uses. A healthy amount of it can prevent disaster. Recognizing, for instance, that it would be best for you not to walk through the known bad part of town, right? Fear can also help you to prepare for the possibility of disaster, giving you the best chance at overcoming it should it come to pass. Fear can raise enough concern for us to seek medical attention for that pain that leads to a curable diagnosis before the disease has progressed beyond treatment. But that same fear can also go the other way when it's too severe, preventing us from seeking medical attention. See, fear is really about control. What we give our fear over to has control over us. And the only place we can safely surrender this control to is with God, who has full authority. Any other fear is neither healthy nor a normal part of our Christian walk. So, all right, let's get to our story. So picture this. We are on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. Now, Jesus has just gone through a significant period of time in his ministry near Capernaum. He taught large crowds of people through parables. He healed those with physical afflictions. Long story short here, Jesus just did a lot and was likely very exhausted. He needed to find a place to rest and recover. Now, because of this, he asked his disciples to get a boat, take him to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, where he could hopefully find some rest. And he was going to need the rest, since he was probably well aware that he was going to encounter two demon-possessed men on the far side. You can almost picture, this situation like a comedy sketch where we got someone in the background, maybe like a Monty Python, someone in the background pops up asking the question, well, how did he know that was going to happen? But Jesus knows everything. Now, it's important to recognize that Jesus was fully man, but also fully God, giving him the ability to empathize with us while also having full authority and being well aware of all outcomes. All right, so verse 23, Matthew 8:23. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. Now let's pause a moment on the Sea of Galilee, because I wanted to describe this, even though Rick found this amazing picture, which is worth 1,000 words that I could say. It's a pretty amazing place, absolutely beautiful, due to it being nestled among the hills of northern Israel. Its surface is about 600 feet below sea level, with the water being a deep blue color. And in spring, when this photo was taken, the hills are covered in green, which makes it highly picturesque. Unfortunately, its location also makes the weather extremely volatile. Sudden violent storms can occur as the wind rushes over the eastern mountains and drops down onto the sea. This is kind of much like we see with tornadoes, right? Where cool air drops down, warm air rising up, smashes together, creating this furious storm. Now, these storms would terrify any one of us. Although you wouldn't think it would bother the disciples, who were no strangers to boating or even the Sea of Galilee. This was their home turf. When Jesus called them, many were seasoned fishermen. For whatever reason, this storm absolutely scared them. We see this in Matthew 24. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. Now, let's go back a little bit. Jesus and the disciples are in an open-top boat, and as the waves began washing over the sides, the disciples began to panic that the boat may actually sink. Now, meanwhile, Jesus is asleep in the stern on a cushion. Apparently, the storm has not bothered him at all. The disciples are frantic. This ship is going down. No survivors. End of story. And in their panic, they finally wake Jesus and ask him whether he even cares that they'll die. Now, in Matthew 28, what it actually says is, and they went and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing," which seems fairly dramatic. Now, Mark's version of the events go even further, right? They actually ask Jesus a question, and this is what it says. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Question's pretty accusatory sounding in nature. It appears that they're assuming a narrative where Jesus doesn't care for their well-being. And this is the point at which Jesus asks a question of them. In Matthew 26, and he said to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith." And then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. Why are you afraid? By itself, this is an innocent enough question, one that we might ask our children if they come into our room after a bad dream. Why are you afraid? It shows a genuine concern for their state of mind. However, Jesus also throws in, "O you of little faith." And this is his way of pointing them to the answer to the first part of the question. See, faith is key here. In the disciples' panic, they seem to forget everything they have seen from him in his time with them. They forget the miracles, they forget his presence, and they forget the authority of who he is. They forgot that their faith in God was supposed to be bigger than their situation. Now let's be real. I doubt that there's anyone in this room that could walk through that situation calmly. It must have been incredibly stressful. Some of these guys had probably lost friends to storms on the Sea of Galilee. At the least, they had more than likely heard of ships being sunk. Nature is scary because it is so far beyond our control. Now, according to the National Weather Service, Category 5 hurricanes with winds up to 157 miles per hour or higher do this kind of damage. A high percentage of frame homes will be destroyed with total roof failure and wall collapse. Fallen trees and power poles will isolate residential areas. Power outages will last for weeks to possibly months. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks or months. The disciples living in this storm in a boat are in genuine fear for their lives. It was a nasty storm. Now, meanwhile, Jesus models perfect trust in God by basically not even being troubled enough by the storm to wake up. See, Jesus understands that his mission is greater than this storm. He remembers that God's plan will not be foiled by a storm. And the disciples should also have remembered their history, a history of deliverances by God. You see, in Exodus, we see Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. They come to the Red Sea. Pharaoh's coming after them. Everyone goes into a full-on panic attack and begins accusing Moses of leading them to their deaths in the wilderness. However, that's not God's plan. See, although it looks like they're stuck between swords and spears or throwing themselves into the sea and drowning, that's not what God has planned for them. To quote from the book, Fight the Good Fight, by Rick Terletsky, without knowing how God would come through for them, Moses rested on the fact that the Lord does come through. In Exodus 14, 13 through 14, and Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." And then the Red Sea parts, and the Israelites walk through. It's amazing how fear can make you forget all that came before. In that story, the Israelites forget all the plagues that God visited on the Egyptians until Pharaoh finally released them. God repeatedly demonstrated his power and his plan through 10 plagues visited upon the Egyptians. The Israelites saw all of it. But in an instance, they imagined that God has forsaken them to die in the desert and lose sight of his promise to them. And this is just like the disciples in the boat. Having lost sight of the prior miracles performed and divinity of Jesus, they forget who controls the winds and the waves. Thankfully, Jesus wakes up and reminds them, not just of who he is, but also of who they are in relation to him. See, God's plan just simply doesn't allow for Jesus to die in a storm. The plan is bigger than the storm, and Jesus knows this. He has faith in God the Father's plan for him, and he knows that it doesn't end in an accidental drowning. He is telling the disciples to rest in the authority that has been given to him. Now, in the end, he rebukes the winds and the sea, and there is a great calm. Matthew 8:27, and the men marveled saying, "What sort of man is this that even winds and sea obey him?" Jesus asked his disciples, all of his disciples, those in the story and those of us here today, what have you surrendered your fear to? Why are you afraid? The second thing he's asking is, where is your faith in me? What have you forgotten about my authority? See, it's not about never being afraid. The question isn't meant to shame us for feeling fear. It's meant to remind us that when we experience fear, we can place that fear where it belongs, with our faith in God. The more often we give over control of our fear to God, the more natural it becomes to find comfort and assurance in our faith in God. In the chaos, the difficulties, the trials, the unknown, life in general. It's the idea that we can be trained to the point wherein things we are not prepared for enter our life, our minds are already renewed in Him to respond like Him, and that we should act like Him in any circumstance. Now, the challenge with this exists not only in the unknown of the difficulty, but also in the way Christ chooses to respond to the difficulty. It may not be the response or outcome that we're looking for. But needless to say, we still need our minds renewed by Him to find peace in His outcomes, because His outcomes are for our good. And it's not something that we do on our own. It's something that Jesus is faithful to come alongside us and walk with us through this fear. It's in these moments of fear that we have forgotten the duality of Christ. We either forgot His sovereignty as fully God, or we forget His empathy with us as He was also fully human. We have a Lord who has experienced everything that we have. He was fully man, yet also fully God, with full authority, having lived a life without sin. We need to remember in Hebrews 4:15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Now, just as we know fear, Jesus also knew it and overcame it through faith in the Father's plan. As we continue to strive to put our faith in God through the storms of our lives, we will begin to see a confidence in Him that grows. As we finish our story, it's important to remember that the ending is Jesus, the disciples, and the boat making it safely to the other side. We are guaranteed to face storms in our lives. Merrill Tenney writes that faith is not a complacent feeling that somehow everything will turn out well. We know, or we should know by now, that sometimes it just doesn't. But Tenney also writes this. He says, the victory of faith is not dodging the storm, but rather in finding the master of them.